very present.
Obviously, we will have a lot to say about his political legacy.
Right.
But Deirdre, can we talk more about the ceremony today? Who is expected to speak, and who are we going to hear from?
Right. Carter's procession is proceeding right now, as you said, up Pennsylvania Avenue towards the Capitol. His grandchildren were appointed honorary pallbearers, and they will escort the military, along with the pallbearers, will escort Carter into the Capitol Rotunda. We'll hear from the Senate chaplain, Barry Black, with an invocation, and then we'll hear from the House chaplain, Margaret Kibben. But then the two top Republican leaders on Capitol Hill will eulogize a president that they didn't really know.
Yeah.
You know? Senate Majority Leader John
Long
Thune.
before their time, yeah.
Right. I mean, House Speaker Mike Johnson was 4 years old, I believe, when Carter was elected president. He's now the Speaker of the House. Thune, this is Thune's, he's into a couple of, he was officially elected majority leader, or became majority leader when the Senate Republicans took over on Friday. This is his first sort of official funeral inside the Rotunda. A lot of leaders preside over these and make speeches. We'll hear from both Thune and Johnson, but we'll also hear from Vice President Kamala Harris. But all three of the people that are eulogizing former President Carter are from a completely different generation. And they all, I think, have one thing in common is, and I've heard this from lawmakers, both Republican and Democratic lawmakers on the Hill since Carter died, it's just this immense respect for his post-presidency, for what he did after he left the White House. And you think about, more than 20 years after he left, he got the Nobel Peace Prize.
Sure.
And then even since then, that was 2002, he's done all these amazing things that Mara mentioned in terms of promoting democracy around the world, promoting human rights. And I think we're going to hear those types of themes in the eulogies today.
There's a poignancy, too, to me, that he will be honored in the Capitol by two Republican leaders, because, as I noted, all of the decisions made around this invoke some sort of symbolism. They say it's the story he wanted to be told about him. And the placement in the Capitol was to send a message of bipartisanship.
Right.
So being honored by two Republican leaders is a nod to that, but also a nod that I think speaks to the fact that we don't live in a particularly bipartisan political moment, and that he wanted to make a statement about that.
He did, and clearly this was planned,
Long
years
in
ago, nor before he knew who would be presiding over this kind of ceremony. And it comes, a day after the Congress certified the 2024 election results, an incredibly partisan, polarizing time in our political life. But I don't think we're going to hear much politics in these speeches. I think it's going to be really respectful tributes to a former president and what he accomplished after. I mean, I don't think the Republicans want to talk about their differences in policies. Yeah. They want to talk about the man and what he accomplished. The other thing that strikes me about this particular Capitol Rotunda service is, Sue, you and I have covered a lot of these in terms of recent years. There's a lot of former government officials who lie in state and other public, officials who lie in honor. The former presidents, the recent ones, have been people like former President George H.W. Bush, former President Gerald Ford. They were both members of Congress, so they had sort of personal ties and a career in the Congress before they were elected president. Carter was not. He was a total outsider before he was elected. And he doesn't have this sort of tie to the Capitol Hill life and building the way some of these other former presidents that had this honor before him did.
I'd love to bring in Ron Elving, NPR Washington senior editor and correspondent. Ron, I'd love to get your reflection on Carter's legacy. And I would note one of my favorite lines I've read about him since his passing is that someone described him as someone who was the only man to use the presidency as his stepping stone to greatness.
That's good.
Well, that's an ironic statement, of course, because he would not have had the power and the breadth of acknowledgement in the world to do all those things that he did that are considered to be the laurels of his life had he not been president. It was important that he was using the power of the office in such a different way from the way it had been used by some of his predecessors, which was either to make money or just to sort of rest on those laurels that they had in the political world. Jimmy Carter was a quite different animal. And what we have seen since is that have been very few people trying to imitate Jimmy Carter in the presidency or in the pursuit of the presidency, and we have seen quite a few people who have moved considerably off of that model.
We should note that the procession is moving towards the Capitol. There are a number of U.S. military officials, a full honor guard, following behind the casket towards the Capitol, dozens of vehicles. We should also note that people are lining the streets up Pennsylvania Avenue and that the coffin should be arriving on the Capitol East Plaza shortly. Ron, I would love to get your thoughts, though, on sort of the pomp and circumstance around these days, because it is hard as an American not to watch this and not be moved by it. It really is a spectacle, and I say that in the most beautiful of ways, the way that this country buries and honors its presidents.
That is true. And if you are old enough to recall the extraordinary events of 1963 November, when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and the funeral and the extraordinary procession on Pennsylvania Avenue, the deathless moment of John Jr., the president's son, saluting as the casket passed and saluting the horses as they drew it. That was an emotional moment for several, really, generations of Americans who were alive at the time. And since then, perhaps the funeral of Ronald Reagan, when they actually paved a broken road in Washington, D.C., connecting Massachusetts Avenue down to the Rock Creek Parkway so that it wouldn't be too bumpy, so that they could take the funeral procession on that Waterside Drive, it's called, and have it be smooth and not have the casket be bouncing around too much. All those who used that road were grateful for it, of course, because it remained smooth after the funeral.
It will be. We should note that the public will be able to pay respects to the former president. The Capitol will be open for public viewing this evening and tomorrow. And Ron, I was thinking about this. If you consider when Carter served and how long he lived, almost half of this country was born after he left office. For a lot of Americans, he's just a memory.
Absolutely. He is really almost a footnote to most people in terms of their own education, their own civic experience. He's somebody who served before Ronald Reagan, and he is often brought into the conversation as the man Ronald Reagan beat or repudiated. That has changed somewhat with the shifting decades of judgment about both Reagan and Carter, and certainly the moment at which the country says goodbye to a former president is a peak moment for appreciation, and sometimes that lasts, and a generation or two that has grown up without any memories directly of Jimmy Carter is now getting some memories of him and getting the very best ones that he could have imagined.
Yeah, I think that what's so interesting about a public ritual like this is it does give people the opportunity, people who were born after he left the White House, to learn about him.
Yeah.
And one thing that we forget is that when he was elected, the country had gone through a tremendous period of corruption and violence and cynicism. And he talked about that in this famous speech that came to be called the Malaise speech, but he never mentioned the word malaise. But it was talking about the kind of almost like a crisis of the soul that the country was going through. And at one point he said, "We were sure that ours was a nation of the ballot, not the bullet, until the murders of John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King. We were taught that our armies were always invincible and our causes were always just, only to suffer the agony of Vietnam. We respected the presidency as a place of honor until the shock of Watergate." So this was a very fraught time for the American psyche. And he famously said, "I'll never lie to you." And he was an honest president. Historians have found it very hard to find any lies. But what's so interesting now is that, honesty and honor are kind of quaint, if not silly, bygone attributes. Ethics is passé. We don't want to dwell on the current moment, but we have a president who's not going to put his assets in a blind trust. And corruption is now mainstreamed. And you have one president who promised never to lie to the American people, and a brand new president, Donald Trump, where a lot of his voters said the reason that they were voting for him was they were assuming he was lying about so many of the things he promised to do, and they knew he wouldn't do them, so they were happy to vote for him.
But to your point, Mara, I do think that I've
kind of extraordinary.
The political legacy is also, and I had not thought about this, but to your point about Nixon, is that historians have argued that Carter could not have happened
Absolutely
without
not.
Nixon.
I agree with that.
And Ronald Reagan could not have happen without Carter.
And I think, well, the story of American presidencies is that they're usually a reaction to the one that came before.
Yeah.
You know.
I would like to bring in Stephen Fowler. He's down in joining us from our studios in GPP in Atlanta, Georgia. Hey, Stephen, how are you?
Hey, Sue.
You know, he has a complicated legacy in Washington, but in Georgia, it seems like the legacy of Jimmy Carter is one of profound admiration.
Absolutely. I mean, I was at the funeral services at the Carter Center, and actually yesterday myself waited in line to pay respects at the public repose at his Carter Center, and I was just struck by how many people from all walks of life, from all over the country, from all different generations were there to pay respects to Jimmy Carter. I mean, in Georgia, for much of his post-presidential life, he was truly a primary source of history. He volunteered with Habitat for Humanity building houses. He taught at Emory University, and I remember my freshman year at Emory, he had this town hall where he would answer questions about his favorite type of peanut butter and what sort of regrets he had about his past. And so he really existed outside of history for people in Georgia, and that was really reflected in his services so far.
We should note that the funeral procession appears to be arriving on the U.S. East Capitol Plaza, where his coffin will be carried up the steps and into the rotunda. While we wait for that service to begin, we want to listen back to some of the memorable speeches Carter gave in his lifetime. The first one dates back to his time as governor. He first ran for governor in 1966, but lost in the Democratic primary to a conservative segregationist. He ran again 4 years later and won. During his inaugural address in Atlanta in 1971, Carter spoke out strongly against racial discrimination and segregation. Let's listen to some of it. I believe we're having some issues with those audios, so I will sum up what he said, where he talks about having a long campaign and bearing the additional burden of talking about the injustices by people in this country and that they shouldn't have to bear an additional burden. And Ron, I don't know if that civil rights and a legacy on civil rights is something that Jimmy Carter is well remembered for, but it's certainly something that he had a strong record of.
It's something he's remembered for in Georgia. And after having taken over that governorship, after the extraordinarily symbolic governorship of Lester Maddox, who once brandished an axe handle to warn black protesters not to come in his restaurant, he gave that speech and said the time for racial segregation in the South is over. And that shocked a lot of people in the audience because he hadn't campaigned on that issue so strongly, but at his inauguration he did. He came out foursquare and forever sealed his reputation as the progressive Southern governor who was going to change the Democratic Party in the South. It didn't all work out on a smooth basis by any means, and race has remained the most contentious issue in American public life. But Jimmy Carter struck a blow when he was inaugurated governor of Georgia back in the 1970s that certainly has remained important to Georgians and also to Americans in general.
Mara, you also made reference earlier to the legacy of what he accomplished in office. And I think that sometimes Carter has been remembered politically as a failed president because he didn't win re-election, that he was a one-term president. But it is extraordinary to look at the number of legislation and the legacy he had as president. He got quite a bit done as president.
Yeah, he got quite a bit done. He also presided over the Middle East peace talks at Camp David. And that was an extraordinary accomplishment. He made some fateful mistakes, like allowing the Shah of Iran to come to the United States for medical treatment, which caused people think the takeover of the American embassy and the hostage crisis there that really bedeviled him until the very end. But he was he was an honest, good civil servant who was undone by events. You know, he was undone by stagflation, which, as we just learned, inflation defeats presidents, and it defeated him. And then, of course, the hostage crisis. And the fact, and I think this is secondary, but that he became known as somebody who was hectoring the American people and kind of giving them moral lectures rather than embodying the idea of presidential leadership.
And Deirdre, if all presidencies are connected by a through line, it's notable to me looking at this list of things that were accomplished during the Carter presidency, how much the Donald Trump presidency is seeking to undo 40 years later, looking at things like the creation of the Department of Education.
I noticed that too. I mean, these are agencies that were created by laws signed by President Carter, and now you have an incoming president, Donald Trump, who's pledging to eliminate some of these departments whole cloth.
Yeah.
Not to mention trying to get control of the Panama Canal that Carter gave
also,
up.
Right. Something that Donald Trump talked about today while he had warm remarks about Carter, who he said he knew some. He singled out the Panama Canal Treaty as a bad deal and clearly something that he's focused on undoing.
Do you feel like the sense, though, that obviously Donald Trump ran and won on these ideas, but it gets the idea that the country is quite comfortable with having things like a Department of Education? I mean, these things are harder, they're easier to build than they are to tear down.
They've also been things that Republican presidents before Donald Trump wanted to get rid of.
Yeah.
Getting rid of the Department of Education is something that's been a long philosophical issue for Republican presidents. We'll see what happens. There's a lot of things that incoming president wants to tear down.
And Mara, there's also, to me, a symbiosis between Jimmy Carter and Joe Biden, who had quite a long and familiar and warm relationship over the years.
Yeah, they did. And you could say that Biden was undone by many of the same things that Carter was. Certainly inflation they have in common. Crises abroad, I don't think it's hard to compare anything to the hostage crisis, which really had people riveted to the television sets every single night. But, the failed or the chaotic exit from Afghanistan was a turning point for Joe Biden. His numbers kind of never recovered after that. But they both were environmentalists, and they both had a concept of the presidency that just didn't work for their time. In other words, Joe Biden is a legislator. He was the legislator in chief. He passed some people say he had the best 2-year legislative record of any American president in terms of just the number of consequential things that he passed. But he wasn't interested in selling it, or he wasn't very good at the performative aspects of selling his agenda. A case in point is he refused to sign the stimulus checks that thousands and maybe millions of Americans got in the mail. They had no idea it had come from him. No single Republican voted for those checks, but Donald Trump famously signed his COVID checks, and everyone knew they came from him. And Carter also was struggled to find a way to talk to the American people about what was happening, to tell a story. He gave this malaise speech, which, as we said, did not use the word malaise. And at the time, it was received well. His numbers jumped. But then he fired his cabinet, or at least the vast majority of them, because he felt that was the way to show that he was going to turn over a new leash, but that just looked like his government was in chaos.
What about the personal relationship between Carter and Biden?
Well, they've been friends for years, and they've had only nice things to say about each other. And I think, Biden's going to continue to honor him. And Carter actually said that when he was in hospice care for a very long time, and he said he was trying to stay alive, not to beat any kind of a record, but to vote for Kamala Harris, to vote for Joe Biden's successor.
Well, Joe Biden was also the first elected member of Congress to endorse Carter's presidential campaign.
That's right.
Which was a bold act at the time.
Yeah.
Right. He was very young and new to Congress, and I think that's something that he's now proud of. It's something that he talked about right after Carter passed away.
We should note that the funeral procession with the president's casket has arrived on the East Plaza of the U.S. Capitol. It is arriving on a horse-drawn caisson, which is an honor given generally to military members, but also to former presidents. It is rarely used, but also part of the deep symbolism of today, honoring the former president. He is accompanied by a full military guard, but also the Carter grandchildren will serve today as honorary pallbearers for the former president, where he will lie in state in the U.S. Capitol this evening and all day tomorrow before a funeral service in Washington, D.C. on Thursday.
Was he also a naval officer?
He was also a naval
officer.
officer. And we should note before his body arrived at the U.S. Capitol, the transfer was made at the U.S. Navy Memorial, and a nod to his service in the U.S. Navy, again, a choice. And another note I should note today, we will likely hear some music. All of the music selections in today's ceremony were decided by his late wife, Rosalind Carter, who preceded him in death and who I believe he will be buried next to ultimately in Plains, Georgia. If Ron Elving is still with us, I would like to talk to Ron more about how you see Jimmy Carter's impact on the Democratic Party and the identity of the Democratic Party when he left office.
That's an awfully good question. One thing I wanted to mention before we left the issue of his placement today is the Lincoln's catafalque, which is a 7-foot box that has been refurbished a little bit and is in use for presidents who lie in state, and some others who have lain in state have used the Lincoln catafalque. It was kept for many years directly below the rotunda in a special room. Now it's in the Capitol Visitor Center, but it's such a rude old box, really. It's just this thing from the 1860s, and somehow there is some eloquence about it being used, not only because of the Lincoln connection, which is enormous, but also because it was connected to so many other presidents and others who have lain in state, and also a few that have lain in honor as a kind of salute. But the effect that Abraham Lincoln had on the Democratic Party was to supplant it as the majority party in the United States. And it was the majority party, at least in numeric terms, if not necessarily in winning elections, for quite a long time until the Democrats made a halting comeback late in the 19th century and then a substantial one in the 20th century, and of course made themselves the majority party with FDR and the Depression and World War II. And we've really moved beyond those two long eras, and Jimmy Carter really was one of the most important milestones in the changing of the majority concept in American politics, not because he was particularly responsible for the Democrats' downturn in their fortunes, but because he did change some of the valence around the issues of the South and therefore took away the most reliable base that the Democrats had had through most of their period of being the majority party. Jimmy Carter played a role in that.
But also, I think about Carter as someone when he lost office and the Reagan Revolution, that the Democratic Party was a bit lost in the wilderness for a decade or more until Bill Clinton won in 1992. And you could also, Ron, argue that the Democratic Party is reliving that kind of moment with the reelection of Donald Trump and not really knowing what the party is or where it goes from here.
Very much so, very much so. And one of the things that Jimmy Carter had was an appeal in the South. He was a populist. He was an evangelical. Bill Clinton was not an evangelical, but he was a populist in his own way and was successful at bringing together, if you will, the progressive, more college-educated Democrats with the populist Democrats who had been the base of the party for generations and generations. There was a wonderful cartoon that showed a pickup truck with a Confederate flag in it and a gun rack right next to a Volvo, and both of these cars were pulled up to a stop sign, and both of them had Carter for President bumper stickers, even though the guy in the Volvo had a herringbone jacket and was smoking a pipe and looked a lot like a college professor. So that was the 76 Democratic magic. Bill Clinton brought some of that back in the 90s.
I should note that the funeral procession is continuing. The Military Honor Guard is beginning to remove the casket and head up the Capitol steps, so the ceremony should begin shortly. And before it does, I think I would like, Ron, if you'll indulge me, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Carter family. We should note that he has no surviving siblings, but attending are 4 of his children, 12 grandchildren, 1 is deceased, 2 are step-grandchildren, and 14 great-grandchildren. And also his wife, Rosalind, who preceded him in death. But I also think if I think about the Carter legacy, it's hard not to think about the Carter marriage, that this Jimmy Carter and Rosalind Carter were really a package deal. And the way he spoke about his wife and how eloquently he spoke of how much he loved her is something that I think he would very much like to believe is part of his legacy.
77 years. Just think about it. 77 years.
Should we all be so lucky?
Yeah, well, it's something if both a husband and wife can both live to be 77. But to be married for 77 years and be as dependent on each other, respectful of each other, clearly in love with each other as these two people were, that is an inspiration to every marriage.
And they not only were married for 77 years, I think they knew each other from childhood.
Yeah, I
right?
think they knew each other their entire lives.
Their entire lives.
Absolutely.
They also run in terms of how they lived their life. You noted that Jimmy Carter was an evangelical, our first evangelical president, and that also played a very significant role, his faith in his post-presidency.
Absolutely. He went on teaching Sunday school at the Maranatha Baptist Church there in Plains till almost the very end. I mean, as long as he could get there, he was teaching Sunday school on Sunday mornings. Now, of course, in the end, when he was so ill and so old, and he was in hospice care, he wasn't still teaching. But a remarkable record of teaching there decade after decade. Even after he had been governor, even after he had been president of the United States, he would show up and teach a Bible class on Sunday morning at that classic Baptist, Southern Baptist church. And, you know, that was a connection for millions of Southerners who might not have had all that much other use for some of Jimmy Carter's politics, but it was a connection because it was such an important part of their lives, and they could imagine themselves respecting someone forever who had that kind of commitment to his church.
The ceremony in the U.S. Capitol should be beginning shortly, but for anyone just tuning in, Deirdre, could you remind us a little bit of how the show will run today and who people will be hearing from to honor the late president?
Right. We're expecting when the procession enters the rotunda, we're going to hear an invocation from the Senate Chaplain Barry Black. We'll probably hear remarks from the House Chaplain, Margaret Kibben. Then we're going to hear eulogies from three top political leaders, both Republican leaders, Senate Majority Leader John Thune and House Speaker Mike Johnson are expected to give tributes or scheduled to give tributes. And then Vice President Kamala Harris will eulogize former President Carter. I think we'll expect to see alongside these top leaders, leaders from both parties of the House and Senate will be in attendance. Likely a lot of rank and file members who are in town who want to pay their respects. This is the first time the public will get to see, pay respects in Washington, and leaders will lead that. We'll also likely see members of the Supreme Court in attendance, the Diplomatic Corps, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, really all of official Washington, even though official Washington really came to power after Carter left. A lot of these folks have made comments in the days following his death about just how much they respect his faith, what you just talked about with Ron. That's been a theme that's come up a lot in terms of how much his faith was important to his role in public life after the presidency, and his accomplishments after he left the White House. And I think there's going to be, Stephen talked about people from all walks of life paying tribute to Carter in the earlier ceremonies that were in his home state. I expect we'll see sort of the same type of thing at the U.S. Capitol. People from multi-generations and all walks of life.
We should also note that there will be in attendance some surviving members of President Carter's cabinet, and if not surviving, by their widows, which is also a nod to them, but including the former Treasury Secretary Michael Blumenthal will be in attendance, as will former Secretary of Labor Ray Marshall. And Deirdre, I also think, to your point, I think about Speaker Mike Johnson and Senate Majority Leader John Thune. Would they be here if not for Carter? And if by that I mean two men who have built their political identity out of the Reagan era of Republican politics.
Right.
These moments, you almost see that it is all sort of connected in some way.
A reaction, and are presiding over majorities that they got opposing the inflation and calling out the inflation under Biden, which is what undid Carter's political ability to get reelected. To Mara's point, in terms of the through line between those two men, but I think that both Republicans, the thing they have in common with former President Carter is their faith. They both talk a lot about it. Speaker Johnson regularly talks about his faith. John Thune gave a long speech when he took power on Friday, his first speech on the Senate floor, and talked about the importance of faith and family. These are all things that, regardless of political party, leaders in this ceremony today, I expect will touch on.
I'd love to go back to Stephen Fowler, who's been joining us from the studios in GPB in Atlanta. Stephen, could you talk more about how Jimmy Carter approached his post-presidency life and what he focused his attentions on?
Yeah, so he very easily could have tucked his tail between his legs, come back after a crushing defeat and said, okay, that's it, I'm done. But instead, he and Rosalind wanted to find a way to keep the work going. So they founded the Carter Center in conjunction with Emory University in Atlanta and thought of this 4-decade-plus long effort to wage peace, is how they phrased it. I mean, he did work with democracy and observing elections across the world. They looked at public health issues in different countries. And, as he got into his advanced age, he said he wanted to outlive the guinea worm disease, for example. And right now, there are, I think, maybe just a handful of cases that we see every year effectively eradicating the disease because of the work that the Carter Center has done. And so instead of trading on his time as president to, do a bunch of speaking tours and book deals and, maybe manipulate how the party goes for the future directions, they really honed in on doing the work that they wanted to do. And that legacy is lasting to this day. I mean, the Carter Center itself, reflective of Jimmy Carter's legacy. It's not a big, shiny, gaudy museum or library. It's tucked into these trees just on the east side of Atlanta. It's very understated. I mean, a lot of people know it for the farmers market that happens every Saturday, and it really just kind of sums up what Jimmy Carter's 40-plus years in post-presidency was in relation to the 4 years he was in the White House.
It certainly seems that humility was a message that they wanted to send with their service. And I recalled in recent days hearing from a person who had built houses with him and Rosalind on Habitat for Humanity, and how on their first trip they sort of slept in dorms on bunk beds with everyone else. They ate in the mess with everyone else, that they made a point never to really seek any type of special treatment in their post-presidency life.
And even at the Carter Center, there's a tiny apartment for them to stay when they visited Atlanta often. And it was a very simple apartment with very simple furnishings. And when Carter went up there for his wife's funeral, last year, he stayed in that same apartment with that same simple bed. I mean, humility is definitely one of the words that people in Georgia who got to see him firsthand got to experience. I mean, as he taught the Sunday school classes, like Ron mentioned, he would talk to people and take pictures with people, even with all of the Secret Service around and this tiny, tiny town of Plains. And I mean, I think Jimmy Carter is an antiquated slice of an American presidency that no longer can exist because of the way our world is. And I mean, Jimmy Carter was just so dedicated to everything that he did, and you could really see it through the work. I mean, answering questions for college students, incoming freshmen, he would answer. I mean, one year somebody asked him what type of underwear he wears. And that's not something you would expect somebody to ask the former president, let alone have that president answer. But he took the time to answer both silly and serious questions and really charted a course for post-presidential life that honestly not many other presidents are going to be able to do given the age.
And he was for real. He walked the walk and talked the talk. And I found this quote where he was asked about why he doesn't want to make any money post-presidency. He said, quote, "I don't see anything wrong with it. I don't blame other people for doing it. It just never has been my ambition to be rich." Which is kind of amazing. And of course, in that speech, and we keep talking about it, he talked about how in America, Americans have lost their way and they're too much interested in consumerism and not in what they can do for others. He was really I don't know if you want to call him an anomaly, but it's hard to see Carterism in America today.
Certainly the style of Carterism in American
yes.
politics. Politics has become more confrontational, more brash, and just frankly more rude, and those are not things he was ever described as.
Right, but I do think the running as an outsider and positioning him as the anti-Washington is something that he does have in common with the incoming president.
Yeah.
Obviously completely different styles and backgrounds in other things in almost every other way, but he was very much, disdainful of Washington. And his appeal following Nixon obviously was to run against corruption and run against Washington that was part of his appeal to voters in terms of, not being one of, the Washington crowd.
And that is certainly a theme that has continued. Running as an outsider is something that many people have done, even people who have spent some time in Washington. Ronald Reagan certainly did. And
Just to recap, if you're joining us recently, we are waiting for the memorial ceremony to take place in the U.S. Capitol honoring former President Jimmy Carter. He will lie in state there for the rest of the day and all throughout Thursday before funeral services will be held in Washington, D.C. on Thursday. Currently, the funeral procession has arrived at the East Plaza of the U.S. Capitol. The president's casket was carried by horse-drawn. It's a type of carriage known as a caisson. Caisson, I believe I've said that correctly. I don't want to get it wrong because the symbolism is important. It's a type of military vehicle that is given to people of high honor and distinction, and including former presidents. His casket is draped in an American flag with a full military honor guard. The casket is paused at the bottom of the steps, awaiting for military members who will carry the casket into the U.S. Capitol, where it will lie in the center of the rotunda, a place of honor in the U.S. Capitol where former presidents have also lined in state. And he will be accompanied symbolically as pallbearers by his grandchildren and several members of the Jimmy Carter family who will all be in attendance today, along with senior members of Congress, members of the president's cabinet, and he will also be honored by Vice President Kamala Harris. Mara, I think for some people who are just tuning in and waiting this ceremony, I think it's worth reiterating sort of who Jimmy Carter was and what his legacy is, especially with the benefit of hindsight of the 40 years since he's left office.
Yeah, I think his legacy is of a politician who tried to do all the things that the American people aspire to do: be honest, work hard, not be selfish. And he eschewed material gains. Even after he was president, of course, he was lauded for his ex-presidency. He's famous for his ex-presidency, and he's considered to be he might be a failure as a president, but certainly a success as an ex-president. He also was the first, we've talked about this a little, but he was a Southern Democrat who was in favor of civil rights. And he took, I guess, Lyndon Johnson's legacy, really, and cemented it as part of the Democratic Party's legacy. And that, as people have said, might have cost the Democrats the South forever and ever and ever.
And contributed to the political realignment
that we have today. But, I was talking before about the malaise speech, and he talked about, I can't even imagine another modern president ever saying anything like this. He said, in a nation that was proud of hard work, strong families, close-knit communities, and our faith in God, too many of us now tend to worship self-indulgence and consumption. Human identity is no longer defined by what one does, but by what one owns. I mean, that's an extraordinary thing for a president to say to the American people. I think there's a lot of truth in it, but not something necessarily that people wanted to hear.
But do you think that there is a legacy and a lesson that American presidents took from that moment, in that it's almost impossible for any American president of any party to tell the people they have to suffer or sacrifice?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And this is why you get, gridlock in Congress. We can't solve our problems of the national debt because we're not allowed anymore to ask any Americans to make a sacrifice.
Well, and also, and in the history of Jimmy Carter, learning about how during the energy crisis, one of the message from the White House was to lower your thermostats
put
and
on a sweater. Put on a sweater.
I can't fathom a president telling the country that they would have to give up something like that in modern American politics.
I don't think that is why Carter lost. I think stagflation and the hostage crisis was enough to defeat him. But there's no doubt that the thought of telling Americans that they have to make any kind of sacrifice is now completely off the table.
Can you talk more, Mara? I think historically, when you bring up the malaise speech, I think that is something that a lot of Americans have some connotation with Jimmy Carter. But as you noted, he never actually used that word. And why was that speech seen as such a turning point in American politics and in his presidency specifically?
Well, what happened was, we were in an energy crisis. There were long lines at gas stations. And his approval rating was very, very low. I think he'd gone from something like 75% when he first came into office to about 28% before he gave the speech. And that is low. That's even lower than Joe Biden got.
Record low.
So record low. So he wanted to level with the American people. And he felt that there was malaise and people were extremely unhappy. And he wanted to talk to them about the things that really mattered. And he did. And as I said, right after the speech, his approval ratings went up. Then he fired most of his cabinet, and it looked like things were
Panic.
Panic. And but and then it became called the Malaise speech, and it just kind of cemented this idea of Jimmy Carter isn't rising to the office. He wore a cardigan sweater. He complained or he hectored the American people like the Sunday school teacher he was, that they have to sacrifice. And, people didn't like it.
I'd love to get Ron Elving's perspective on this, too, and how it sort of changed the expectations for what the president can say. Because I think about this now, even if you think of the annual State of the Union address, Ron, the State of the Union is always strong, that the American president must always present even bad information in a really positive light.
That's right. And I am hearing that word malaise in the voice and the accents of George H.W. Bush in 1980. He was the vice presidential nominee with Ronald Reagan. And he loved to use that word and dwell on that word, malaise, he would say. And you could just hear people writhing and just, hating on that word and everything that it represented. It was way overblown, and as Mara has pointed out, it was not in the speech, but it became what people knew about the speech. And I think this is the problem with so much that we need to do in civic education, I guess, is really where it starts. But what we have to do in sharing information about government is to point out that it is not just a matter of being popular. Sometimes it's a matter of doing things that need to be done, or asking everyone in the room to make some sort of sacrifice, to ask everyone to go over the cliff, if you will, together and take a similar risk. You give up something you say you won't. We give up something we say we won't. And maybe we'll see how that sorts out. And in the long run, history, at least, will judge us more kindly. The problem is most politicians are not thinking in terms of history. They're thinking in terms of their next election, 2 years, 4 years, however long away it is for them individually. And they don't want to take a lot of risks in the meantime because they have to raise money in the meantime. And if their poll numbers go down, their fundraising goes down, and they never even get a chance to compete again.
Yeah, and it's also amazing how congealed these, now we would call them memes, but the idea that
I know
Carter,
how you feel about memes, Mara.
that how Carter was, hectoring the American people, and he didn't rise to the occasion, and this was the Malaise speech, and that really hardened. And I think he did a lot to change his reputation after he left the White House. But here's a quote from a 2011 profile of Carter in Rolling Stone. He said, the author says, "Carter is the great national sinking feeling. Carter is where you end up when you lose your way." I mean, I think this notion that he was a failed president, it really took hold. And history might change that view. But right now he's seen as the super successful ex-president.
Although, Mara, I think it was Mara who said that someone like him might not be able to run and win again. But I do think of the parallels of a Carter-like story to someone like Donald Trump, who came from outside the establishment.
As an outsider, and that will certainly happen again and again and again.
And who is willing to say a lot of things that a lot of other American presidents might not be willing to say, and has support for it.
Yes, but not to appeal to the better angels of people's natures.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's popular versus policy again.
Yeah.
In fact, someone once asked Trump if he were a populist, and he said he would call himself a popularist, which I think is rather apt.
Yes, that's so apt. Whatever is popular, he's going to go with. Yeah, but Jimmy Carter didn't do that.
I also think that Carter, in some ways, that Malaise speech and that word malaise came to define him in his presidency. But Stephen Fowler, who's joining us from Georgia, it's also worth noting that there was this light side of Jimmy Carter. There was this, and one of the things about him was he had this deep and sustained love of music that had remained one of the constants throughout his life. And that was on display. There was a 2020 documentary called Jimmy Carter, Rock and Roll President, which is not something that I think he's often considered with. And Stephen, you looked into that part of his life about how music played a role. What kind of music did Jimmy Carter listen to?
Well, you may be surprised to learn that Jimmy Carter liked gospel music.
Well,
his choices for a lot of his symbolic funeral music include some of his favorite hymns. The Navy hymn, Eternal Father, Strong to Save, has been featured prominently. It's one of his choices. He was friends with Willie Nelson. He also brought jazz to the White House. he brought jazz to the White House, and actually one of the early NPR broadcasts was Jazz from the White House Lawn, and he came up on stage to do Salt Peanuts with Dizzy Gillespie because Carter was a peanut farmer.
So wait, he played an instrument? Or
Well, he sang the song. It's a jazz song. The words are salt peanuts, and so he could do that.
Pretty easy to
with
learn.
With his skill. But his 100th birthday party in October, they threw a giant musical gala at the Fox Theater in Atlanta with all sorts of artists from all sorts of backgrounds. I mean, when he was governor, he backed anti-piracy legislation, and that's how he became friends with Macon's Capricorn record artist. When he ran for president, the Allman Brothers did campaign concerts for him. There was a folk song of Jimmy Carter, Why Not the Best? And so, music is one of those things that, you have Barack Obama and his playlist that he put out. You have Bill Clinton and the saxophone, but you don't really think about Jimmy Carter as the rock and roll president.
Definitely
But there's so
not.
much about him
Also,
that just fits.
on the Allman Brothers, one thing that Jimmy Carter started that other candidates followed is he invited the Allman Brothers to headline a campaign rally to help raise
Is
money.
that where this came from?
Yeah. and he was the first one to do it.
wow.
And candidates ever since have
Wow.
featured, name musicians. And he had this famous rally in Providence, Rhode Island before the New Hampshire primary that his job was to introduce the Allman Brothers. He was actually the candidate, but people came to see the Allman Brothers.
He was the opener for the Allman
exactly.
Brothers. Also in the documentary, Stephen, I'm going to pause for a moment. And we're starting to hear music. I believe the official ceremony may be beginning. The president's casket is on the East Plaza of the U.S. Capitol. It's accompanied by a full military guard, and we are awaiting movement of the casket up the steps into the U.S. Capitol Rotunda, where today's ceremony will take place. The late president is set to be honored and eulogized by Vice President Kamala Harris, Senate Majority Leader John Thune of South Dakota, and Speaker Mike Johnson of Louisiana. Other people in attendance will be members of Congress, governors, members of the current cabinet, and former members who served in the Carter administration, as well as members of the diplomatic corps and, of course, of the Carter family. We should also note that the late president and his late wife, Rosalind Carter, played a role in deciding all of the details of today, including the music you will hear that will be provided by the U.S. Army Band. Some of the hymns, including God of Our Fathers and O God, Our Help in Ages Past, were specifically selected by Rosalind Carter to honor the late president. Deirdre, we should also note that there's a tremendous amount of symbolism throughout all of the services honoring the late president. But as we are watching it now, he was accompanied, his casket arrived and came down Pennsylvania Avenue and up Constitution Avenue to arrive at the U.S. Capitol in honor to his own inauguration.
Right, where he became the first newly inaugurated president to get out of the limousine and walk down Pennsylvania Avenue in the inauguration parade. That became a tradition that other presidents since him have followed. I think that was a very personal thing that the president did because he wanted to show he was of the people. And today, the plans and the procession reflect that. That was a choice that his family made, and his family members got out and walked with the procession back up towards Capitol Hill.
The casket is now moving. It is being carried by members of the U.S. military. Honorary pallbearers include Jimmy Carter's grandchildren. Deirdre, the casket will be carried up the East Capitol steps, of which there are many, and it will lie in the center of the U.S. Capitol Rotunda on the Lincoln catafalque. Can you talk more about the symbolism of using that in today's ceremony?
Right. Well, Lincoln was the first president to lie in state in the Capitol Rotunda, and the tradition started with that catafalque, which Ron Elving talked about earlier, the symbolism, and they've used that catafalque in the years since to be the foundation of other elected official leaders, former presidents, former senators, other members who've been granted this honor of lying in state or lying in honor in the Capitol Rotunda. It's a sign of respect, but it also marks our history, right? I mean, there have been, I think almost 50 individuals. Sometimes there were, unknown soldiers that were more than one that were granted this honor of lying in honor. But, not that many people have had this honor. And this type of ceremony in terms of a former president is, sort of the next level of honor and a tradition that our country, puts together for former presidents. It's just a remarkable moment to mark a former president who, a lot of people, as Mara said, don't know. A lot of people in the Capitol weren't alive or didn't have any real personal connection to him. But since he's died, we've heard from lawmakers across the political spectrum talk about what he represented, and to that idea of a person of faith and a person of service, and what he did for his country, I think is something that is very unique to a former president who had such a long post-presidency and accomplished so many things that essentially, I think, overshadow a lot of the things in his presidency. We talked about Mara, talked about his accomplishments, but I think he rehabbed his image as a humanitarian, as a promoter of democracy around the world in a way that we probably won't see from anyone else.
We should note that the late president has been given a 21-gun salute outside the U.S. Capitol. We'll listen for just a moment to hear some of the U.S. Army Band play him in. The casket is now entering the U.S. Capitol, where it will make a short procession towards the center of the U.S. Rotunda. The casket will lie in the center of the U.S. Rotunda on the Lincoln catafalque. And Carter will be honored today by Vice President Kamala Harris, Senate Majority Leader John Thune, and House Speaker Mike Johnson, who will also lay wreaths onto the casket ahead of a public viewing where members of the public, the Capitol will be open throughout the evening and all day tomorrow, so everyday people can come and pay their respects to the late president. You're listening to live special coverage from NPR of funeral services for the late President Jimmy Carter, which are set to begin momentarily in the U.S. Capitol. The president's casket has entered the building and is being accompanied by a full military honor guard, where it will be laying on the Lincoln catafalque, a platform first created following the death of U.S. President Abraham Lincoln, and is used certainly for former presidents and other people of honor who have lied in state in the Capitol in the past. In attendance today are many members of Congress, members of the diplomatic corps, the Biden administration, including members of the former Carter administration, and of course, all living members of the Carter family. Speaking today will be Vice President Kamala Harris, Senator John Thune, the new majority leader from South Dakota, and Speaker Mike Johnson. Both Thune and Mike Johnson are Republicans who will give honor to the late Democratic president. Members in attendance are waiting in silence for the casket to be brought in. It's a short journey from the steps from the East Capitol Plaza into the rotunda, but the military honor guard moves very deliberately and in step with each other. The honorary pallbearers today are Jimmy Carter's grandchildren. And Deirdre Walsh, congressional correspondent, we should note that these are incredibly poignant moments within the U.S. Capitol. It's hard not to just be struck by the symbolism and how much of today's details have been given so much thought as we honor a late president.
Right. They've been planning this, the Carter family, since the mid-'80s. You can't help but feel the history in that room in the Capitol Rotunda. You're surrounded by statues of former presidents, other military leaders, other distinguished American personalities that have been given places of honor inside the Capitol. You also see in the Capitol Rotunda right now, I can see in the first row, there are members of the Georgia delegation that are right up front, both Republicans and Democrats standing side by side. This is a very bipartisan moment. Earlier today, House Speaker Mike Johnson, at his regular press conference, talked about his role paying honor to Carter. Same with Senate Majority Leader John Thune on the floor earlier today, talked about the importance of paying tribute to the former president and how they look forward to coming together with people from both sides of the aisle to mark this special moment.
We should note that former presidents certainly have the option to lie in state, but they don't have to. They have to want to do it. Clearly, Carter wanted to. And in the information provided about all of the details around this service, he wanted to lay in state in the Capitol as part of the message. He wanted his funeral services to end. And it says, noting that he, in his time, encouraged bipartisanship, reaching across the aisle to move our nation forward for the people. The ceremony here today is by design and one he wanted.
And it comes at a time of incredible political polarization. But it appears, and I think we can look forward to that being set aside for this occasion. Leaders in these moments really do strike a tone of the historical importance in covering these before. Members of both parties really make a point to talk about the person, to talk about what they meant to the country and to their family.
I'm going to pause for a moment. I believe we're waiting to hear from, or just Vice President Kamala Harris has entered the rotunda. She will be offering one of the eulogies today. I believe they are waiting for members of the Carter family to be seated before beginning the proceedings. And Speaker Mike Johnson and Senate Majority Leader John Thune, who will also pay tribute to the late president. Members are standing in silence. This is also a private ceremony. It's not open to the public, but once this concludes later this evening, the building will be opened up to the public for anyone who would like to come and pay respects to the late president. He will lie in state here all throughout Wednesday before funeral services in Washington, D.C., ahead of returning back to Plains, Georgia, where he will ultimately be buried on Friday. Members of the military guard have entered the rotunda, and the casket, I believe, is beginning to proceed towards the center of the rotunda. We should also note the Lincoln catafalque. It's also covered in sort of a black drapery on a black platform. Let's take a listen. The casket carrying late President Jimmy Carter has entered the U.S. Capitol Rotunda, accompanied by a full military honor guard carrying the American flag. Carter's coffin has been lowered onto the Lincoln catafalque, where members of the U.S. military are picking up the American flag that has draped it. The ceremony will begin shortly. First, we are expected to hear from Barry Black, who is the U.S. Senate chaplain. The military honor guard is proceeding out of the U.S. Rotunda, where the ceremony will begin momentarily. A lone soldier now stands in the center of the U.S. Capitol Rotunda, standing watch over the casket, holding the late President Jimmy Carter. There will be several speakers at today's ceremony. First will be heard from U.S. Senate Chaplain Barry Black. Then the late president will be honored by the congressional leaders, John Thune, the Senate Majority Leader of South Dakota, the first such role he will play in his new job as Majority Leader in the Senate, as well as House Speaker Mike Johnson of Louisiana, both Republicans. Then Kamala Harris, the Vice President, will offer a eulogy. The music that you will hear today will be provided by the U.S. Army Band, and all the song selections were made by the late president's wife, Rosalind Carter, to honor him today. The military honor guard is taking a place surrounding the late president's casket. We should note all of these ceremony activities are the highest honor that can be given to a U.S. citizen, which is typical of former presidents, but also been in design since the late 80s, where the late president and his wife took a role in deciding and directing the funeral procession for how he would want to be honored, including the stop in the U.S. Capitol, where he wanted to send a message of bipartisanship to the nation. This is U.S. Senate Chaplain Barry Black.
Eternal Father, strong to save, whose arms have bound the restless waves. We thank you for the inspiration of a consequential and laudable life as we celebrate the legacy of James Earl Carter, Jr., the 39th President of the United States. We proclaim your generosity to this nation and world for giving us the gift of someone with the ethical congruence to be salt and light to his generation. Lord, he made the world more palatable. We thank you for his passion for integrity, his commitment to leave the world better than he found it, and his exemplary love for his precious Rosalind. Inspired by his great life, teach us to know you more clearly, to love you more dearly, and to follow you more nearly each day. We pray in your matchless name. Amen. In your matchless name. Amen.
That was U.S. Senate Chaplain Barry Black. We are awaiting a eulogy from Senate Majority Leader John Thune of South Dakota.
Madam Vice President, Mr. Speaker, Leader Schumer, Leader Jeffries, Jack, Chip, Jeff, Amy, and other members of the Carter family, and distinguished guests. Today we gather to begin a final farewell to Jimmy Carter, Navy veteran, peanut farmer, Governor of Georgia, and President of the United States. Sunday school teacher, Nobel Prize winner, advocate for peace and human rights, and first and foremost, a faithful servant of his Creator and his fellow man. In a commencement speech he delivered at Liberty University back in 2018, President Carter told a story about going on a mission to Massachusetts back in his younger days under the auspices of the Southern Baptist Convention. During that trip, President Carter was impressed by the success of a fellow missionary in winning souls to Christ. And so as the mission was winding down, he asked him what made him so successful. He was a little embarrassed by my question, President Carter recalled, but then he finally said, I try to have two loves in my heart. One love is for God, and the other love I have in my heart is for the person who happens to be in front of me at any particular time. It was a statement President Carter said that he never forgot. And I think it's fair to say that it's also a statement he lived by. President Carter's term as president ended in 1981. And for the remainder of his life, the longest post-presidency of any American president ever, he focused on making the lives of his fellow men better. That meant things like the Carter Center, which, among other things, works for the eradication of disease in some of the poorest areas of the globe. And it meant things like his work with Habitat for Humanity to provide affordable housing for those in need. And when I say his work with Habitat for Humanity, I do mean his work. Jimmy Carter knew that his status as a former president could bring attention to good causes. It's why he encouraged Habitat to make use of his name and image. But simply lending his name, or maybe attending a gala or two, wasn't Jimmy Carter's style. He was here to get down in the weeds and the dirt. And he did that literally on numerous habitat builds, including one back in 1994 in Eagle Butte in my home state of South Dakota. Well into his 90s, he could be found with his hard hat and tools on construction sites doing the practical work required to get families into homes. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. And Jimmy Carter did his very best to live according to the calling of his Lord and Savior. Today, I join all Americans in mourning President Carter and remembering his example. But I rejoice in the thought that he, together with his beloved wife, Rosalind, is now before the face of his Father.
That was Senate Majority Leader John Thune of South Dakota. Speaking next will be House Speaker Mike Johnson of Louisiana.
To the family, to Jack and Chip and Jeff and Amy, the entire Carter family, Vice President Harris, members of the Cabinet, Leader Thune, my colleagues in Congress, and my fellow citizens. We meet in this sacred hall of self-government to honor an extraordinary man, a man who modeled the virtues of service and citizenship, as well as any other American. Surrounding us are the statues of those who gave their time, their energy, and their lives for the good of America. Before us lays a man who now joins their midst as a patriot, a veteran, a humanitarian, and the 39th President of the United States. When Jimmy Carter walked out on the east front of the Capitol and took his oath of office, I was just 4 years old, and he's the first president that I remember. Looking back, it's obvious now to me as an adult why he captured everyone's attention. Jimmy Carter was a member of the greatest generation. He lived through the Great Depression. He did that on a farm in rural Georgia. He knew the value of a dollar, and he modeled thrift his entire life. As long as he was in office, he hated government waste. His father, an Army veteran of the World War I era, taught patriotism to his children. And eventually his son, this young man from Plains, followed his father's example of self-sacrifice, and he joined the Naval Academy in the middle of World War II. In the Army, Lieutenant Carter learned from the legendary Admiral Rickover to always do his best as he served on the first fleet of nuclear submarines. It's telling that today the USS Jimmy Carter, a top-secret attack submarine, now roams the oceans, bearing the name of the only president who served in such close quarters. President Carter's life, his selfless service, his fight against cancer, and his lasting contributions to his fellow man are all truly remarkable. Whether he was in the White House or in his post-presidential years, as was discussed, President Carter was willing to roll up his own sleeves to serve and get the job done. We all know about his work with Habitat for Humanity, and that was mentioned. And the origin story goes that it was in 1984, when he first became aware of the work. He was in New York for a friend's anniversary. Millard Fuller, the founder of the fledgling charity at the time, called President Carter and asked if he wanted to visit a site in Brooklyn during his trip. President Carter agreed, and he found his way down to the Lower East Side. Standing on the roof of a dilapidated building, he looked out on the wealth of Wall Street to the south and to the power of Midtown Manhattan to the north. And then he looked down, and he saw an image he'd never forget. An elderly woman cooking breakfast over an open fire in the rubble of the building, there in the heart of the richest city in the world. The Habitat for Humanity worker that was there with him turned to President Carter and said, if there's anything that you can do, we would take it. He said, if there's anything I can do, let me know. The worker said, well, maybe you can send some volunteer carpenters from your church. It was the very next day that President Carter called Habitat for Humanity and told them he was going to send some carpenters, all right, and that he himself would be one of them. and thus began his famous tradition of donating 1 week every year to build and restore homes for his fellow Americans. It's remarkable to think that one of the 45 men who has served as president, and one of the only 13 who held the role in the nuclear age, would humble himself to such service. We all know that his care for humanity didn't stop at building homes. In the face of illness, President Jimmy Carter brought life-saving medicine. In the face of conflict, he brokered peace. In the face of discrimination, he reminded us that we are all made in the image of God. And if you were to ask him why he did it all, he would likely point to his faith. I'm reminded of his admonition to, quote, live our lives as though Christ were coming this afternoon, and of his amazing personal reflection. Quote, if I have one life and one chance to make it count for something. We all agree that he certainly did. So today in these hallowed halls of our republic, we honor President Carter, his family, and his enduring legacy that he leaves, not only upon this nation, but upon the world.
That was House Speaker Mike Johnson paying tribute to the late President Jimmy Carter at a ceremony in the U.S. Rotunda of the U.S. Capitol. Next speaking will be Vice President Kamala Harris.
Leader Thune, Speaker Johnson, Leader Schumer, Leader Jeffries, members of Congress, and distinguished guests. It is an honor to be with you this afternoon, and to Jack, Chip, Jeff, Amy, and Jason, and all the other members of the Carter family. On behalf of the American people, Doug and I offer our deepest condolences. Being with you today, I'm reminded of the enduring words of a favorite hymn. May the works I have done speak for me. Today we gather to celebrate the life of a man whose works will echo for generations to come. A man from Plains, Georgia, who grew up without electricity or running water and served as the 39th President of the United States of America and lived every day of his long life in service to the people. President James Earl Carter, Jr. So I was in middle school when Jimmy Carter was elected president, and I vividly recall how my mother admired him, how much she admired his strength of character, his honesty, his integrity, his work ethic and determination, his intelligence, and his generosity of spirit. We have heard much today and in recent days about President Carter's impact in the 4 decades after he left the White House. Rightly so. Jimmy Carter established a new model for what it means to be a former president and leaves an extraordinary post-presidential legacy. From founding the Carter Center, which has helped advance global human rights and alleviate human suffering, to his public health work in Latin America and Africa, to his tireless advocacy for peace and democracy. He was the first president of the United States to have a comprehensive energy policy, including providing some of the first federal support for clean energy. He also passed over an energy policy, including providing some of the first federal support for clean energy. He also passed over a dozen major pieces of legislation regarding environmental protection, and more than doubled the size of America's national parks, including protecting our beloved redwoods in my home state of California. He was a president who, between the years of 1977 and 1981, appointed more Black Americans to the federal bench than all of his predecessors combined, and appointed 5 times as many women. And in the wake of Watergate, Jimmy Carter passed historic ethics legislation to help rebuild America's faith in government. Jimmy Carter, as president, was also a respected global leader. To be sure, the years of his presidency were not without international crises or challenges, but his legacy of global leadership is well established. In Asia, he instituted full diplomatic relations with China, which he would later call one of the most historically significant accomplishments of his presidency. And his legacy lives on in the Middle East because, do recall, in the decades before Jimmy Carter became president, Israel and Egypt had been at war numerous times. Few thought peace could be achieved between them. Yet Jimmy Carter did that. Through his persistence and perseverance, through his unshakable belief in the power of American diplomacy, he secured the Camp David Accords, one of the most significant and durable peace treaties since World War II. And throughout the world, Jimmy Carter elevated the role of human rights in America's foreign policy priorities and uplifted the importance of civil society in doing that work. Jimmy Carter was a forward-looking president with a vision for the future. Consider his establishment of the Department of Energy in 1977, which anticipated the central role it would play in addressing the climate crisis. His creation of FEMA in 1979, which enabled our nation to mobilize a national response to disasters, which has helped countless communities rebuild and recover. And his founding of the Department of Education later that year, which elevated public education institutions and increased national standards for the education of America's children and future leaders. Jimmy Carter was that all too rare example of a gifted man who also walks with humility, modesty, and grace. Recall the stories from the 1976 campaign about how he slept in the homes of his supporters to share a meal with them at their table and to listen to what was on their minds. How on their first trip for Habitat for Humanity, Jimmy and Rosalind rode the bus with the other volunteers. And when the group stopped for the night to stay at a local church, Jimmy and Rosalind gave their private room to a young couple who had put off their honeymoon to join the trip. And with the other volunteers, they then slept on the floor of the church basement. And then, of course, his work to eradicate the vicious guinea worm disease that once disabled millions of people a year. It was one of the Carter Center's greatest triumphs. And Jimmy Carter, of course, given his nature, attributed its success not to his own leadership, but to the thousands of everyday Africans who were on the ground doing the work. Throughout his life and career, Jimmy Carter retained a fundamental decency and humility. James Earl Carter Jr. loved our country. He lived his faith, he served the people, and he left the world better than he found it. And in the end, Jimmy Carter's work and those works speak for him, louder than any tribute we can offer. May his life be a lesson for the ages and a beacon for the future. May God bless President Jimmy Carter, and may God bless the United States of America.
That was Vice President Kamala Harris paying respects to the late President Jimmy Carter at a funeral ceremony in the U.S. Capitol in the Rotunda. We are waiting to hear from the U.S. Naval Academy Glee Club. Jimmy Carter, of course, attended the Naval Academy, where they will provide a hymn. We'll take a listen as he would have wanted. That was music performed by the U.S. Naval Academy's Glee Club for the late President Jimmy Carter, who attended the Naval Academy. You were listening to funeral services for him taking place in the U.S. Capitol in the Rotunda, where he's been eulogized by Vice President Kamala Harris and the congressional leaders. We are awaiting the leaders and the vice president to lay wreaths onto the casket before the ceremony will conclude with a benediction from the U.S. House Chaplain, Margaret Kibben. Members of the military will remain and guard the casket where the president will lie in state in the U.S. Capitol throughout the evening and all day tomorrow, where the public will be able to go and pay their respects. There will also be funeral services in Washington, D.C. at the National Cathedral on Thursday before the late president will head home for a burial in his hometown of Plains, Georgia. Members of the U.S. military are presenting wreaths before the casket now, with members of the leaders of Congress, including Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. I should note former Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, current Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, along with Senate Majority Leader John Thune, accompanied by a member of the military, they will place a wreath in honor of the late president beside the casket. We should also note that dozens of members of the Carter family are in attendance today, as well as many members of Congress, including those in the Georgia delegation, members of the Biden cabinet and the former Carter administration cabinet, as well as members of the diplomatic corps and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The leaders are standing before the casket paying their final respects. And members of the military are saluting the casket. Deirdre Walsh, as we await the benediction, those were some rather moving remarks from both the leaders and the vice president, who didn't personally know him all that well, but were clearly moved by his life and his legacy.
Agreed, and I thought they both had very personal reflections about what Carter's life meant to them. I thought the opening invocation from the Senate chaplain Barry Black summed up Carter's life remarkably. Consequential and laudable life is what he said about former President Carter.
Yeah, Mara Liasson, Vice President Kamala Harris, she said he left the world better than he found it. And that's a moving thing to say, but also I think one that no one would quibble with.
Yeah, and what was so interesting about her remarks is she focused a lot on what he did while in office, where the two Republican leaders talked a lot about what he did after he was in office, talking about his work with Habitat for Humanity. But she talked about how he had a lot of foreign policy accomplishments. He kind of rebalanced the relationship with the United States and China. He presided over the Middle East peace between Israel and Egypt, who, as she said, had been at war with each other several times. And he created the Department of Education and the Department of Energy.
Also a progressive in terms of what the federal government should look like, noting that he put more women and people of color on the federal bench. I believe she said he put more people of color on the federal bench than all of his predecessors combined.
I believe that.
Yeah, that was striking to me.
And wasn't something we heard a lot about when you heard about his death. It was mostly about what he accomplished afterwards.
Yeah.
But she went deliberately at some of the things he did in office, including ethics legislation in reaction to Watergate.
And we should note the House leaders, Speaker Mike Johnson and House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, are now laying a wreath on behalf of the U.S. House on the other side of the casket to honor the late president. The ceremony will be concluded shortly with a benediction from the U.S. House chaplain, who will close the ceremony. It was opened, of course, by the Senate chaplain. Deirdre, I thought your point that was very notable to me. Mike Johnson is also a leader who I think relies on and cites his faith as a central driving force of both his life and his politics. And in that, he found common cause with Jimmy Carter.
He did, and so did John Thune.
Yeah.
I mean, I think both of them talked about, Carter's mission and model of a public life. And I think that the comments about Habitat for Humanity were both things that they raised in terms of his post-presidency, and also his willingness to roll up his sleeves. Like, he was a very humble man, and they both talked about, that. Obviously, Vice President Harris talked a lot about that too, how he slept on the basement floor in the church with Habitat for Humanity volunteers. It's hard to imagine.
I'm trying to picture
political leaders now adopting that kind of approach to their post-presidency.
Yeah, a deep focus on his humility and also on the simplicity with which he lived his life, even though he lived, American presidents are few. They are part of, obviously all the pomp and circumstance and honor of him today is important, and it's how we honor our presidents. But in his day-to-day life, he lived a rather simple American life.
He did. I also thought it was notable that Mike Johnson talked about Carter's naval career, and that part of his legacy is that there is now the USS Jimmy Carter roaming the sea on a mission still, and that he was, the only president in the nuclear era that served on a submarine.
Vice President Kamala Harris is also laying a wreath on another side of the casket. And this is the Glee Club, the U.S. Naval Academy Glee Club. That was the U.S. Naval Academy Glee Club playing tribute to the late President Jimmy Carter at his memorial service in the U.S. Capitol. The ceremony will conclude shortly, awaiting a benediction offered by the U.S. House Chaplain Margaret Kippen. Dozens of members of the Carter family are in attendance, many weeping as they listen to the U.S. Naval Academy, where Jimmy Carter
Holy
attended.
and loving God, receive into your eternal joy your good and faithful servant, James Earl Carter, Jr. Reward him richly and grant him your own well done for his humble and honorable life, worth far more than the many accolades and attributions we have gladly given. May President Jimmy Carter now rest from his labors and be received into the embrace of your everlasting arms. And when the ceremony and fanfare due this man of character and compassion fades into history, when the processions and parades have dispersed, leave with us, O God, the lasting impression and inspiration of a life well lived. Ignite in us the same passion for public service, the courage to champion the underserved, the strength to bear as faithfully the weight of the call to which you have called each one of us, to do as justly, to love mercy as unreservedly, to walk as humbly with you as we have witnessed in the testimony of President Jimmy Carter's life of faithfulness. We offer our prayers in the name of the one whom Jimmy Carter would have known to be the first and the last, the Alpha and the Omega, his rock and our Redeemer. Amen.
You're listening to special coverage from NPR News. I'm Susan Davis, and NPR's Ron Elving has listened to the ceremony and joins me. Ron, America may have some faults, but honoring its past presidents is not one of them. That was a rather moving tribute to the late president.
Indeed, from beginning until this last set of prayers really being offered, I was struck, and I think Rosalind Carter, were she here, would be pleased to note not only that there was a woman among the eulogists and a woman giving the final benediction, but also when we first heard from the U.S. Naval Academy Glee Club, it was the women's voices, the women in the choir who were singing at first. The men, of course, came in to join them, but we heard a distinct presence of women's voices. Now, that may not strike anyone as odd, but it was 1976, the year Jimmy Carter was elected president, that women were first admitted to the U.S. Naval Academy. And 4 years later, when he was president, that Elizabeth Ann Rowe became the first woman member of the class to graduate. So there was a tribute there.
Marla, it's a complicated and storied legacy of the late president, and not just honoring who he was as president, but so much focus on the man that he was and the life he led after he left office.
And it was, yes, an extraordinary life, but also so unusual. I mean, the story about him working for Habitat for Humanity and taking the bus with the other volunteers, and they had put aside a room for him to sleep in a church where they were going to sleep on their way up to the Lower East Side of New York, and he decided to give the room to a newlywed couple who'd put off their honeymoon to go on this Habitat for Humanity service trip. And he slept on the floor with the other Habitat for Humanity volunteers. I mean, that's just mind-boggling. And he was an extraordinary man, and I think that there was a time when the kind of devotion to service was more common. But you know, we have after Jimmy Carter came the greed is good era, and it wasn't as honored. But this was a chance for people to learn about an extraordinary president and an extraordinary American.
Deirdre Walsh, as we noted, all of the details in all of the funeral ceremonies honoring the late president were decided in part by the late president himself. They all carry symbolism. They all had a reason behind it. And part of the reason he wanted to lie in state in the U.S. Capitol was to send a message to the country about the importance of bipartisanship, which is a message maybe worth remembering in this very divided time.
I think they succeeded. I mean, this was a rare political honoring ceremony that was free of politics of Washington. I mean, you had all of the speakers, 2 Republicans and the Democratic vice president, really echoing the same theme. You know, Thune talked about, remember his example. Speaker Mike Johnson talked about how he was a model. And then the vice president talked about, his legacy of service and humility and grace. I mean, these are all things that political leaders, would be mindful to remember.
I think it was Johnson's line or I can't remember who said it, but that he left the world better than he found it. And what better way can anyone be memorialized?
We would all love to be remembered that way.
You have been listening to live coverage from NPR News. I want to thank my colleagues who joined us for today's coverage, NPR's Mara Eliason, Deirdre Walsh, Ron Elving, and our colleague Stephen Fowler, who joined us from Georgia. Our coverage of Jimmy Carter's life and legacy will continue over the next couple of days on air and online. You can tune in to our live special coverage of the National Funeral Service at the Washington National Cathedral on Thursday at 9:30 a.m. Eastern, where the former president will also be eulogized by President Joe Biden. I'm Susan Davis, and this is NPR News.